It's been brought to our attention by a reviewer on Spotify that we swear too much. Now we genuinely appreciate the feedback we get from all of you, and to be honest, this time we've got to hold our hands up. So I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of both of us, really, to say we sincerely fucking apologise for this, and that we fully intend to stop being utter wankats.
That's right.
And to start being just a Nat Fanny, more professional from now on.
That's right.
Hi there, and welcome to episode 34 of the got it wrong already. The ADHD Adult Podcast. Not going to be a good one. It's already started bad. I'm James Brown, not that one. And as usual, I have the scrotum shrinkingly awful responsibility to guide this crashing blimp of a podcast alongside my co-pilot, everybody's least favourite person, Dr. Alex Connor. Hi, Alex.
Hiya.
Sorry. Hiya. Any reason for that one? Well, obviously it's to annoy me, but
Yeah.
Losing
the question.
The most rhetorical question ever. Anyway, I hate this part more than anything in my life. How are you, Alex?
I'm very well, thank you, James. Yeah, as always, pretty good. Been busy. I've lots of communications from our wonderful listeners. I've been sent a letter from Robert from Kidderminster.
Really? He's prolific, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. He says, dear Alex, I heard your podcast on the ADHD tax, but James doesn't pay his actual taxes. Thanks, Robert. It's one for the HMRC, I think.
Brilliant. It's not wholly wrong.
No one checked. Can I read you a real message from a listener, please?
I'd rather you did. I'd rather you only did that in the future, to be honest. But yes, please do.
Right. So a listener who messaged us called Chris.
He didn't message you, did he? He messaged me. No one messages you.
Shut up. He says, "Hi guys, just wanted to send you a quick note. Thank you for the amazing and honest content you've both put together. I stumbled across and have flown through all episodes. Can't wait for the next one. I was officially diagnosed and prescribed my first round of medications last week. Congratulations. I did the clothes washing, drying, and folding all today. Fucking unheard of. Sorry, Spotify. You both, along with the dextroamphetamine, but mainly you both, have made this journey for me an incredibly positive experience. So thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. That is absolutely lovely.
Brilliant.
I love those letters. Stroke messages. Please write in. As we now have an unbelievable 105 countries that have at least one sacrificial listener to this, and because the number 105 is coincidentally ever so slightly higher than James's IQ, I want to say obrigado e bem-vindo to our Brazilian stroke Portuguese listeners and Portuguese listeners. Hi to both of you.
Thanks for that, Al. Your mashed up Portuguese has now probably lost us listeners in 2 countries. So well done there. Moving on, as usual, this calamitous dog tod of a podcast is a tragedy in 3 parts. We choose a theme. Dog Todd, yeah. We choose a theme. In the last episode, we had a special guest on with, now it says here, Alex's friend, Tom Watson.
That's right.
Yeah, clearly. BFF. And this week we're talking about a subject that actually we've been meaning to record for ages, but we've got ADHD because a lot of people have asked for it. And that is to talk about, I've lost it. It's gone. It's literally not in the script. So
that is brilliant.
It is, isn't it? I know.
Spectrum disorder, James.
Yeah, it's on the bottom of the screen and that, but obviously I was struggling. So yes, we're going to talk about ADHD and autistic spectrum disorder or autistic spectrum conditions. So shout out to Evidence-Based Doula and Roxanne and many others for suggesting that we cover this. As usual, the 3 really badly produced parts include some evidence-based psychoeducation, our personal reflections on ADHD and autistic spectrum traits, as well as autistic spectrum disorder. And then the third and final bit where we'll give you some incredibly useful top tips, mostly from me, Al. I'm sure you'll agree, on the area. So let's kick off. It's time for Alex, el mono de la psychoeducación for our listeners in Spain, or plain old pig fucker for everyone else, to talk about ADHD and autistic spectrum disorders. That's probably 5 fucks in the first 5 minutes, which is pretty much what someone complained about. So fire away, Alan.
Okay, firstly, James, swearing is neither big nor clever. Secondly, there is a lot of evidence that ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, ASD, commonly co-occur. ASD and ADHD are the two most common neurodevelopmental disorders in adults, and they've been found to have a high genetic overlap and natural co-occurrence. Okay, I'm using the word disorder here, and I'm using it advisedly. People with autism are not one voice, and some people choose to describe their autism as a difference, some as a developmental disability, or some as something else. We are not the autism police judging words. James is, however, the fashion police.
I kind of wish I was, because if I was the fashion police, you'd be utterly fucked. I mean, look what you're wearing now. Is that like a polo shirt? Like
Regular.
£6 from Primark, is it?
I don't know what that is.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't know what that is. So getting back to what you've just said, it sounds like you're being a bit cagey there. Is that because you don't want angry emails and letters?
Yes. Anywho, both ASD and ADHD are reported to have had substantial increases in prevalence within the past 15 years. Now, this is probably because we now diagnose them more, not because they have increased particularly, or because, we've got mercury in our vaccinations. It's just that we look for them now because it's a problem. While some people argue that ASD and ADHD are part of the same continuum, wrongly, research suggests that there is some overlap between the two disorders, yet there are enough differences to indicate that these conditions warrant separate diagnostic categories. ASD, like ADHD, is a childhood onset developmental disorder or disability. Also, like ADHD, its diagnosis is dependent upon evidence of impairments, in this case, impairments in social communication and social interactions, as well as persistent and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior or interests. About 1% of people are thought to have ASD. But if you look at the ADHD community, it ain't 1% anymore. One pretty large study found that 13% of young people with ADHD were diagnosed with comorbid ASD, and a whopping 40 to 70% of children with autism spectrum disorder also have ADHD.
Those numbers are quite big for you, aren't they? You normally don't go past double digits, kind of 10, 11, 12, and you start to struggle, because I know you've got 11 fingers because you come from Utoxeter, but anything beyond that is a problem. Now, I get a bit confused because you've mentioned autism spectrum disorder. But there are other names, obviously. So the nomenclature, I do know big words, Alex, around this confuses me a bit. So can you clear that up?
You get confused quite a lot, don't you, James? Right. So ASD is autism spectrum disorder. ASC, or autistic spectrum condition, is effectively another name for ASD, which we tend to use as that's its diagnostic name, ASD. So health professionals as well, they typically would say ASD. Some people prefer ASC because the word condition is less negative, I think, or feels that way.
So we tend to use these acronyms now, don't we, generally?
No, James, because acronym has to spell a word, like nice guidelines. What we use is abbreviations for ADHD.
Oh my God. Carry on.
So, just for completeness, there's also the term Asperger's, you might hear. Medically speaking, the term Asperger's isn't used anymore in new diagnoses, partly because it's a form of autism now, or ASD now, and isn't used medically unless you're pre-diagnosed and choose to keep the term, and partly because Asperger the man was a massive bellend.
Yeah. So
right, sorry, James. Is it okay if I ignore you for a bit so I can actually get this section done properly?
Yeah,
I asked you the question, but I'm just going to ignore you anyway.
Please.
So there is an established crossover between ASD and ADHD, and it's a big but, James, even without a formal diagnosis with both, it is pretty clear that many adults with ADHD exhibit traits of ASD and vice versa. These are not enough for a diagnosis, but clearly can be challenging and even distressing. ADHD often comes with social impairments. This might reflect impulsivity or hyperactivity, such as interrupting James, or responding inappropriately to people, James. But they might also reflect more general social dysfunction.
Don't you fucking dare.
Some of these issues we face, and you and I really do, don't we, James? Some of these issues we face have remarkable similarities with ASD, with autism disorder, but they're not as profound in many cases. So, for example, using the brilliantly named eyes test, I like that. So people try to determine the mental state of someone from a photo based only on a photo of black and white pictures of their eyes. Those with ASD have the hardest time with this, but in studies, people with ADHD also have a deficit in doing it. It's just not as profound on average.
Right.
Also, low levels of reciprocal friendships, another shared feature that between ADHD and ASD. We have a reciprocal friendship, James.
I was about to say, have you ever had a reciprocal friendship, Al?
This is one. ADHD and ASD seem to share overlapping and yet unique executive dysfunction and sensory processing issues. These aren't diagnostic in ASD, but are present in 90% of people. They're also commonly seen in ADHD, with problems in auditory, vestibular, visual, tactile, sensory modalities.
I've said this before. Your academic position was in science communication. I believe I'm right in saying, Alex.
That's right.
So is there any way you could explain those terms you just used for human beings, just remembering that not everybody else has a tiny brain bouncing around in a massive moon-shaped head?
Ouch. They're just normal words, James. Just innocent words. Okay. So in terms of the modalities that we can struggle with, and I do as well, is auditory is just sound. Vestibular is the position and movement of your head. Visual, I'm pretty sure even you understand that, James. And tactile means referring to touch. Adults with ADHD can become quite overwhelmed by sensory overload, just like in ASD.
Right. Well, thanks for that, Alex. I could say I could listen to you talk about this for hours, but that would be bollocks. So we'll take a break now, and we'll be back in part 2 for some personal reflections. See you in a bit.
We should call this podcast 5 Fucks and a Bollocks. Welcome back to episode 34 of the ADHD Adults podcast. We today are talking about the similarity and differences between ADHD and ASD, autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. ASD, sorry. In the second part, this is part 2, we will talk about our personal reflections of this theme. I should probably do a disclaimer about personal reflections that neither James nor I have been diagnosed with ASD. So we're going to talk about how it feels to us hearing about the overlaps and if we have any similar symptoms. James, can you kick it off?
Yeah, I can. So I think my personal reflections aren't so much going to be, why have I picked that pen up? I don't know. Aren't going to be so much about what we've heard, but it's an odd one for me because I don't have many traits of ASD as part of my ADHD, and that for me should not be the focus of this podcast because you've written what parts of it for once, but actually because of that overlap in symptoms, there are definitely things that I can recognize. So I can definitely become overwhelmed due to sensory overload. If there's too much noise, particularly different noises, so if someone's talking and there's music and the television's on, Robert from Kidderminster stays with us every 2 weeks, and he's 91 and he's deaf as a post, so the television has to be on at DEFCON 1, and when it's that loud and I'm trying to do a bit of work because I want to sit near him, and equally he's talking to Mrs. ADHD, I can't. It's completely overwhelming. I have to get out of the room. So noise is an issue. Touch, tactile overstimulation. I fucking hate being touched, and that's quite a big one for me, even by Mrs. ADHD, to be honest, but especially by others. And the best example of this is that a few years ago, Mrs. ADHD took me to a spa for a facial, Al. And you won't believe this, but I've never had a facial before. And I went into this room and I didn't really know what to expect. And of course, Mrs. ADHD hadn't explained it to me. So I lay on the thing, bed, whatever it is.
The milking table.
On the milking table, yeah, in my knickers, covered up with a sheet. And the person giving the facial, or the group of guys giving the facial, didn't really explain the process. So, and I assumed wrongly that a facial would include my face, and therefore it would start with putting some kind of substance on my face. I didn't understand that it started with her touching my feet, and she didn't tell me. So the first thing I felt when my eyes were closed was somebody suddenly start massaging my feet. And what happened is I kicked her in the face.
What are you talking about? A facial?
Because, yeah, it's a particular type. It was an acid peel or something. And the whole thing is they're meant to start by relaxing you. So they start by kind of rubbing your feet a bit. She didn't tell me. And with the foot she wasn't touching, I kicked her in the face. I just lifted my leg up and kicked her in the face because the shock.
My fingers are going.
Exactly.
My bum's going 50p.
I was so it was just, I was so uncomfortable. It was just get off. And I literally kicked her in the face. And whilst I do like hugging people, it's because it's on my terms. So I will hug people hello and goodbye because I'm in control of that. I saw that little face, you bastard. But if someone touches me and I don't expect it, it's spiders crawling over my body and I really can't cope with it. And these things kind of likely fit into traits of ASD. You know, the issue with being overwhelmed by sensations. I've also noticed that if I feel I'm in a really uncomfortable situation, and for some reason, normally this comes down to my low self-esteem. If I feel I can't walk away, if it's even being around family, I stim like crazy. You know, I have to. I rock and I stim and I have traits which are associated with ADHD, but they're not diagnostic, but are sometimes also associated with ASD. What about you?
Yeah, I like this one. I recognize a lot of traits that friends of mine who describe themselves as autistic also have. In science, as you know, James, a lot of us have ASD. I don't know if it's more ADHD or not, but certainly ASD is a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
I think most ADHD people I know have thought about it before. I've wondered whether they have ASD traits at some point. My personal view, so don't write in because it's not science, is that the cause of my behaviours and preferences that look very similar to ASD are actually ADHD, and they're not two ends of a spectrum, these two, they're just similar. I have rigid, repetitive routines, not because I'm uncomfortable, but because if I don't, then every fucking option's on the table. I have the same lunch every day, the same, I have for years, because if I didn't, and I'm not having that lunch today, so the other options might include an entire gatto or a flight to Ibiza instead of a ham sandwich. So it's not because I'm uncomfortable, it's because the options are wild.
Yeah,
I have serious problems with hyperstimulation, especially photosensitivity, light, but and noise and touch and all those things. And people, but in my case, I think my brain just doesn't know what to pay attention to, and it feels painful. Well, obviously, it doesn't know I've got ADHD. I don't think it's the same cause as ASD, even though it looks the same. I'm often not, James, socially aware.
Okay, good one, mate.
I know, but I think in my case that's because I'm impulsive and overexcited. I can, in fact, easily and clearly read the cues. My brain doesn't care, so I say or do it anyway, and then the shame and guilt and hatred. So I knew what to do and didn't do it, rather than just not reading them. I think that's the difference, but very similar.
One of the things I'd just quickly like to talk about that's shared to some extent between ADHD and ASD is stigma. I want to tell a story about 3 universities ago, back in the day, Al, when I was a young, unhappy,
in your 40s, weren't you?
Yeah. Back in when I was in my 40s, I sat on the ethics panel of a university 3 universities ago, and there is this kind of apocryphal or myth. I don't know if I've used those words correctly, because obviously
almost certainly not in my experience.
You'll correct me if I'm wrong, as I usually am. The individuals with ASD don't have a sense of humor, and this myth is quite persistent. And an academic 3 universities ago had written an application to do a study where they wanted to test this theory, and they'd written a series of jokes, 10 jokes, and they were going to read them out to people with or without ASD to see if they find them funny. Now, I didn't find any of these 10 jokes funny because they were objectively not fucking funny. So I wrote down, you've got to reject this, because unless you've got like a marker of whether a joke is legitimately funny,
wow,
what the hell? But again, there are these persistent myths and stigmas about both ADHD and ASD, and that's one of the reasons we're doing this is to try and educate people, not just with ADHD, but anyone who happens to stumble upon this fucking dog shit podcast that we do and might be interested in either subject. You know, we've got to remove this stigma. We've got to educate, because a significant number of people have either or one of these disorders. Now, I'm sure Alex would love me to say it's time to take a break, but unfortunately, it's not. It's time for us to play another game of What Has James Lost, Mislaid, or Forgotten this week. Alex,
you can't read the social cues about this game, can you?
I clearly can't. Obviously, you can't read. Actually, that's not true, is it? Because you do read a lot. But as long as it's about 16th century monarchs, for example.
And the surrounding courtiers, don't be so closed-minded.
He actually said to me the other day, I sometimes dip into the 15th century as well. Fucking hell. Right, anyway, I think you've got 13 right out of about... I've given you an extra. Anyway, if anyone knows the score,
13?
Can you please message us to let us know, because I don't know. We'll say it's 13.
No, 16.
Out of 16, fuck off.
Approximately. Give or take.
About 24.
Let's play the game. Jesus.
I recently visited the Derek Bowie World Fan Convention, as it was called by people who messaged me to say that. Thanks to you.
I love you for that, people. I love you.
There are people out there messaging me saying Derek Bowie instead of David Bowie. So I went to the Derek Bowie World Fan Convention in Liverpool. I had a brilliant time, and because I know you don't really pay attention to my social media output, I impulsively bought a record, my favorite Derek Bowie album, Station to Station, and I saw what was an early repress. You don't understand cultural references, Alex. That means that it was issued in a year, and then a couple of years later they repressed it. So an early repress, it's quite good, and it was really good quality. So I was like, 40 quid sold. I walked out and there was something shonky about it. So what I want to know is, what was shonky about this record that I bought? Was it A, the wrong album? Was it B, the wrong year? Or was it C, the wrong artist?
Ooh. Good question. I don't think it'd be the wrong artist, because you have a picture of Derek on your bedside table.
Yeah. And a tattoo of him on my leg as well. Although I was told by a friend it looks more like David Beckham than Derek Bowie.
I know that is. What was the first one?
Wrong album. Wrong year, or wrong artist.
You
didn't. Oh no, you did actually. You did use the insulting me as your.
Yeah.
Apologies.
It was just subtle. That's why it passed you by. Not the wrong. I don't think it's the wrong album, because he probably only had one. I don't know who he is. I think it's number 2, wrong year.
Fuck. Yeah.
Yes.
So what I didn't notice, and this was in big letters on the front on the sticker, was it said 1972 repress. The album wasn't released until 1976. So I bought a repress that was released 4 years before the album was released.
And that's what shonky means, is it? Just fraudulent.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I didn't notice that obviously until I'd left the Derek Bowie convention and was walking back to the hotel, proudly holding this album. Then went, oh, fuck. So, so that's my inattention as opposed to losing something. That means you've got 14, and you've ruined my day. You've ruined my day, Alex. You've ruined my day. Thank you. Right, we can now actually take a break, and we'll be back with some top tips in part 3. See you in a bit.
Be it sane.
Welcome back to the third and final part of episode 34. Of the ADHD Adults podcast. Oh, it's written on the screen, yeah. 34 of the ADHD Adults podcast, where we're talking about ADHD and ASD. Too many acronyms?
No.
No.
Abbreviations.
Yeah. Okay, so out of my generosity, because actually my top tips have been getting better recently, and it makes
I
you
certainly haven't been hindering people. For
well, yeah,
a
no,
change.
yeah, I haven't actively killed somebody through a
No,
bad tip, at least in
not
the
since
last 3 or
podcast
4 years.
23, I think.
Exactly. So I'm going to let you go first, Alex. Do you have any top tips about this subject?
Yeah, so obviously this lived experience of ASD and ASC is more important than anything we can say. So this is psychoeducation stuff and ADHD stuff rather than ASD. I think, James, as you know, we should have called this podcast "Emotional Acceptance." Blah blah blah.
We do when we're offline, don't we?
We do, yeah. It's really hard learning how to regulate some of our social dysfunction, whatever we have, when we really want to, but doing that without masking who we actually are. That's the balance that is really difficult. I think if you think that maybe you have both ADHD and ASD, my top tip is just have a really good think, preferably with like a friend or a counselor or someone.
Call Tim, maybe.
Did I say top tip?
Top Tim. You said top Tim.
This isn't helpful. It's a serious bit. So have a think about the elements of both of these things that negatively affect you and the people around you the most. These are probably the ones to work on for me. Especially, I mean, that's true if you just have ADHD, especially if you think you have both ADHD and ASD traits. We all know there is a fine line between disorder and neurodivergence. And there are some aspects of my neurodivergent brain that I kind of like. For example, I have some amazing and very dangerous anecdotes in my past. I don't think having the same lunch for a decade is a massive deal, and always wearing sunglasses through the winter or noise-cancelling headphones a lot. I think it comes down to self-authoring what you want to change and what you don't, and control. So I would say that thinking about strategies to deal with the behaviours that I would like to change and which ones are the important ones, so what to tackle first. That's my top tip here. I had a recent message on the Twitter from someone saying, I have both. What should I get sorted? And my view is, well, you really need to talk to somebody about this, and it depends what is affecting you the most. And yeah, that's it. That's the top tip. Not helpful, I guess. What about you, old friend?
I wasn't listening to any of that.
No,
I mean, not just because obviously you bore me to the point of desperation.
Yeah.
I was just my mind was wandering. Okay, so James's top tips, which is really should be renamed. So what I would say is that, and the last thing you said about which should I get seen to first, I think it's a really important point, because the treatment options for the two different neurodivergent conditions are not the same. For ASD, there isn't a medication, there isn't a drug or a treatment you can take which will reduce your symptoms. It's really about managing those symptoms and learning about your neurodivergent condition. So for many, it's challenging to know whether you should pursue a diagnosis of ASD. I get lots of messages saying, I've just done the AQ50, which is an autism spectrum disorder test where you fill in a load of questions and it tells you whether you are likely to have an autistic spectrum disorder or not. And they'll say, I came out with a score of 37 and it says possible. So what should I do? And what I'll always say is, well, again, it's really up to you. If you feel that the traits of ASD that you've got are really having an impact on your life, there are things that will help, but there isn't, methylphenidate or amphetamine to treat it. So if you feel that you have both, my advice would be, because ADHD is treatable. Now I don't know the waiting times for ASD assessment, but I'm imagining they're pretty shit, just like ADHD, because it's largely the same teams in the community that deal with these things. It's largely teams associated with neurodiversity. So, you go with whichever you feel you need to target, but just remember there isn't really a treatment as such for ASD. But if you feel you really need to know, or that it will help you explain you, then seek a diagnosis. As you know, getting diagnoses for any psychiatric or developmental condition isn't easy. We've talked about this so much, and we're not blaming the NHS, because the people working in the NHS are working their asses off, but they're just
hamstrung as well.
They are. They've been massively under-resourced for years, so they just don't have the capacity. What I would say is, though, that now Right to Choose, which we talked about for ADHD, also exists for autistic spectrum disorder. So if you did want to get a diagnosis, you can go to the GP and say, please refer me to insert provider here. using my NHS constitutional right to choose where I go. So that will bring down the waiting time. Secondly, if you find that you've got ASD traits and you're in an environment that you're uncomfortable with, like being at Alex's house, for example, learn to accept that it's okay to get out. And this is an ADHD and an ASD thing.
Yeah, it really is.
Speaking of Alex, and I visited you, was it last week? I can't remember.
Yeah.
And within 4 seconds, I felt uncomfortable and wanted to leave. But because, you know, we had jobs to do, I couldn't. And there, again, I was stimming for a good 6 hours in your house as I really wanted to get out. Seriously, though, I did want to leave. No, seriously. I really struggle with this, even in the most accommodating of company, even in my own home. Sometimes I feel like I can't leave because of what people will think of me. And I am working on this. I've got there in some situations, some social situations where I can just walk away, but I'm not in others. And learning to put yourself first is a big step. Emotional acceptance, blah, blah,
blah, blah, blah. Very good, yeah.
Fabulous. Right, we've got a product recommendation of the week. So we mentioned an app, I think, last time. This is a different app. It's an app called Finch, and it uses gamification to drive you to self-care more. So it's a little bit like a shit Tamagotchi, in that you've got a bird on your phone, and it will keep reminding you to go in, and it will give you points if you do some press-ups, or if you have a drink, or if you meditate, or if you do something nice. Mine is already dead, by the way. So it's clearly not worked for me. But Mrs. ADHD engaged with it for a good 10 days, I reckon, before she got bored with it. So give it a bash. It might help you. On that note, that was episode 34 of the ADHD Adults, where we talked about ADHD and ASD. If you want to get in touch, contact us on the socials, or just contact me, because obviously you don't want to contact him. If you've got any suggestions for future podcast episodes, or you just want to say hi, and we will see you soon. See you later.
Bye all.